Well, welcome, Congressman Armstrong. Thank you for joining us for a quick interview today. I'm Katie Mastel, Government Affairs and Advocacy Manager here at the Chamber, and I'm joined by my colleague Mason Rademacher, Public Policy and Workforce Coordinator. Mason, I'll invite you to ask the first question.
Awesome. Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Congressman Armstrong, for your time this afternoon. We'll start with the topic that is on the top of everybody's mind right now, COVID-19. We've seen multiple rounds of legislation over the past few months, and now there's talk of another piece, likely sometime in the future. There have also been conversations of whether or not to include an additional stimulus payment or not. What do you anticipate will be included in the next bill, and what do you foresee as the timeline for its passage?
Well, the timeline is probably how Congress works all the time. We don't ever work at all without a deadline. So we come up on August recess, July 31st. That's when some of the previous things in the COVID packages expire. So if and what that package looks like will probably be done by that date or very shortly thereafter. I think the biggest issue, and before we get past this issue, I'm not sure. I mean, obviously cost and different issues, but the two things I hear about from North Dakota the most is extending the $600 unemployment, just blanket with no guardrails, but more importantly, liability protection for businesses. That's the one that concerns me. I'm glad Senator McConnell has kind of made that a red line. I will tell you from my time in judiciary in the U.S. House that I'm not sure that House Democrats are going to buck the Trial Lawyers Association. So if the Trial Lawyers Association and Democrats can't get on board with some kind of liability protection, which I think is absolutely needed, we're going to have a difficult time coming to a deal. And then there's still other things to talk about. The $600 unemployment is a huge issue. It doesn't matter if you're in the ag industry or the service industry in states like North Dakota that are continuing to open up. It's a terrible place to be where somebody can make more money staying at home than they would at their job. And it's also a terrible place to put employers, because even if you get people to come back to work, if you have a business with 6 employees and all 6 of them are mad at being there, we shouldn't force those people into that position. At the same time, I think when PPP money runs out, particularly in Western North Dakota, we're going to have an issue with an area of the state that, and this isn't just Western North Dakota, but it's obviously oil patch. And when the PPP money runs out, we're going to have a place that was effectively at 0% unemployment be significantly higher. And we have to figure out a way to allow those people in those communities to get through this as well. So I'm not sure why we've been home for 2 weeks. These things seem pretty complicated. They seem like this negotiation would be one of those long drawn out affairs that goes till midnight in the bottom of a room, and we aren't doing that. We're going back next week. A recess starts July 31st, and we have to negotiate between the House, the Senate, and the White House. And I'm a little cynical as to whether we can get that done. I'm really hopeful we can get something done. So I would like the program to be smaller scale, targeted at the things that we have missed in the first 3 programs, and really address what we see moving forward, and not just a $3.5–4 trillion bailout to everybody.
So the president has said before, $1 trillion is kind of his top dollar. It sounds like is where the White House is kind of sitting as of right now. And then, like you said, Leader McConnell has said liability protection is a must. If those 2 things aren't met, do you think anything will even be passed? I mean, eventually when somebody comes down to a negotiation, I think the better question is whether I will vote for it. Okay. And that will wholly depend. Listen, whenever you do these huge bills, there's a lot in there to like, and there's a ton in there not to like, and you just have to weigh it that way. I'm really concerned, even as we go through all of this, that if we incentivize entire communities and economies to stay closed, that is not the right direction here. One of the problems, I think, with COVID in general is we've continued to move the goalposts. This was never about curing the virus. This was never about eradicating the virus. If that was our stated goal, it wasn't our stated goals. But if it was anybody's goal, they don't understand science very well. This is about ensuring we had the medical capacity to deal with it. And states like North Dakota, we're seeing an uptick, and we should be cautious and we should be concerned. But I don't think we would shut down New York City because we had an outbreak in Bismarck. And I don't think we should shut down Bismarck because Florida is having a spike in cases. So we need to deal with that. We need to give locals flexibility to move through this.
So keeping on with COVID, and you mentioned PPP and where that money's at, that was very, very widely used, and the deadline was just extended to August, but there's still roughly $130 billion left untapped, or there was at the end of June. So 501c3s were eligible to apply for funds. However, the 501c6s, which are organizations like the Chamber and other associations who provide support to businesses, weren't eligible to apply. So just question for today is, with billions still left untapped, do you think eligibility should be expanded to include 501c6s and other entities that were originally left out? And if so, what could a potential timeline look like for that?
So the question becomes not whether or not the Chamber is a 501c6, what other companies are 501c6s? Because politics that are completely different than COVID-related politics start coming into play in this, whether you're talking Planned Parenthood, whether you're talking all of those issues. So unfortunately, I think in a lot of these extensions, normal, typical conservative versus liberal, Republican versus Democratic things come into play. That being said, I think we should target, ag's a perfect example. You know, they have never fit neatly into the PPP program, right. Particularly small family farms. The problem with some of that is we don't know what it looks like yet. I mean, we know they're struggling, we know all of that, there's a lot of different factors there, but until we get closer to harvest and those types of issues, we should do that. But I think, Katie, that's a perfect example of where we should target this towards places that hopefully we can come to, because at the end of the day, this has to be a political consensus. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to do something where Planned Parenthood qualifies, it's just not going to be one. Yeah. Regardless of your personal feelings, regardless of your Democrat or Republican, big state, small state, I'm just telling you, there's not going to be a political consensus on whether Planned Parenthood can get PPP loans. And that's just the reality we live in. So how do we target it towards agencies? You know, and it's not just the Chamber, it's other support groups, it's trade groups, it's things like that, and working forward. So yeah, I would like to see something. If I knew what the timeline was, if I gave you an idea on the timeline, I'd be lying and or guessing.
All right, sounds good, we'll take that.
So transitioning a little bit, but staying on the COVID-19 topic overall. Yesterday, Governor Burgum and Superintendent Baszler announced the North Dakota K-12 Smart Restart Guidance, paving the way for a hopeful and on-time start of the fall school year for our K-12 students. As a part of what they outlined yesterday, individual school districts have the ability to opt into in-person, fully online, or a hybrid of both. What are your thoughts on how to safely reopen our schools, and should our students and teachers be back in the classroom? Yes,
I hope they are back in the classroom. I can tell you, I have 2 kids at home. I'm very proud of both my kids. I think they do a better job in school than a lot of people, and distance learning is very difficult. I'm going to also say I completely commend every single school in North Dakota for getting this up and running as fast as they did. I think it truly is amazing, and they should absolutely be acknowledged for that, because it was fantastic. I mean, how my daughter's school handled it and how my son's school handled it, I can't imagine how they got that all up and running at that time. That being said, we are better off when our kids are in school. And again, this is not just a school issue and all of that, it's an economic issue. Science is going to dictate that, and I think the decision is right. What's going on the ground in a county in North Dakota that maybe has had 1 COVID case since the entire outbreak versus Fargo versus Bismarck are very different. It also tends to fit into my general philosophy about education. It's best if the people in your local communities are making the decision. The state should be a second, and the federal government should be a very, very, very almost can't see them distant third. So I think we will deal with that. I mean, a perfect example is Fargo. You know, we've got, I think, one of the smartest governors in the country, and the mayor of Fargo is a doctor. Let's let those guys involved in making this decision, and let's keep politicians and bureaucrats in DC out of it as much as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of sticking on that for just a second, in the event that learning is transitioned online, either fully or partially, whether it's in a urban or rural part of the state of North Dakota, some of our students and teachers still don't have access to high-speed broadband internet. What role do you believe does the federal government play in ensuring that everyone in North Dakota has a reliable internet connection?
So I think broadband is one of those areas that there was a lot, particularly rural broadband. But broadband, I mean, there's broadband deserts in cities as well. I like to needle our very smart governor that one of the slowest internet, so historically some of our slowest internet speeds have been in Fargo. And North Dakota actually does a way better job than most people about rural broadband. However, our Native American reservations struggle. South Central North Dakota, down by Grant, Carson County, is a broadband desert. And I think this has really proved up the point that access to reliable internet is essential in the 21st century. Now, two things. One, I said there's been bipartisan support for that moving forward, and I think that will continue. The problem is in the near term, that infrastructure takes a while to build out. But secondly, North Dakota can show the model to do this in the rest of the country. We've got state, local, sometimes federal, co-ops, private businesses that understand how to deliver this in rural communities and make it economic also, and we need to continue to work on it. The problem is when you're starting school system, I mean, even if the federal government passed a bill tomorrow, that infrastructure will take time to build out, which is one of the problems with distance learning is, I mean, and not just for internet, food insecurity, I mean, different issues that go on at homes. School is often a really good place for kids who don't have the world's greatest life to come and be an equalizer. And we have some of the greatest teachers in the country, and that goes away over distance learning. One of the things we know is that isolation and these locking in of people and stuff. I mean, there are consequences to that, and that's not COVID related. There's a reason. We have some of those same issues pop up in rural North Dakota in January and February when snow is on the ground and stuff. So kids will be safer in school provided we can do it properly, and it's a better way to educate people.
Mm-hmm, certainly. So pivoting topics, but staying on another really big issue right now. So last week we saw the U.S. District Judge James Boasberg's order to temporarily shut down and drain the Dakota Access Pipeline. And now yesterday, U.S. Appeals Court said that the pipeline can continue to operate amid the ongoing court battle. What are your thoughts on this recent news and its impact on North Dakota?
Well, the recent news is good. The judge's decision was terrible. We could talk about the actual underlying issue all day long. I was a part of that. I was in the state legislature. Obviously, it's an industry I know a lot about. Right. But I think I would like to, if there was ever a reason to have venue reform in the federal government, this case is it. And the reason is I'm not even going to talk about whether the permit was deficient, because I don't think it was. But even we'll acknowledge that the judge said the permit is deficient. It's still a two-pronged test, and it's the level of the deficiency. Well, one, President Obama's Corps of Engineers said all they needed was an economic analysis. It was only after the White House overruled them that they went to the economic impact study. So I'll argue on the core deficiency of the permit, but the second problem of that test is economic disruption to essentially the state of North Dakota. Mm-hmm. And I am fairly certain this judge has never lived anywhere that they've grown anything, built anything, or produced anything. And that's one of the problems with DC. It's a fantastic town. It's the center of democracy in the free world. They don't grow anything, build anything, or produce anything. Because how he analyzed the economic disruption to not being able to move 40% of our oil out of North Dakota is quite frankly fiction. And everybody in North Dakota, this is not an oil industry issue. This is a North Dakota state budget issue. If you care about the diversion, if you care about human services, if you care about educating your kids, you care about this decision. And I don't know how to be more frank. I don't think you can be pro this judge's decision and pro North Dakota. I don't think you can be both.
Yeah. So can you touch, we had an Eggs and Issues just a little bit ago here, we talked specifically about the issue of oil and its impact on the economy in North Dakota. Mm-hmm. Obviously, you're very well versed in that from being in the legislature and such. Can you touch a little bit more for our members on? Yeah,
it accounts for 60 to 75% of the state budget, depending on how you do the math. It's pretty much that simple. It accounts for 100% of what goes into the legacy fund. It accounts for 100% of what goes into our water resources trust fund, and it is. I wish, as North Dakota, I love agriculture, I love energy. I wish our economy wasn't so commodity-based and cyclically based. Mm-hmm. It has been, it will be, even as we continue to diversify, get better in the tech center, do all of those things. Ag and energy are still going to drive North Dakota's economy, which means they drive North Dakota's budget. Mm-hmm. And the reality is this is happening all over the country right now. The plaintiffs are different in every case. The plaintiffs' lawyers are the same. They're getting more sophisticated. They have figured out in their zeal for environmental advocacy, which is about the nicest way I can say that, they have realized that transporting carbon fuels is where they have the best chance of winning, particularly in court. And the reason for that is states control drilling, states control production. But transportation across state lines ends up into these permits. And they won one with the Keystone XL, which actually shut down the nationwide Corps of Engineers Permit 12 program. Duke and Dominion Energy just abandoned a pipeline in the East Coast. They obviously won on the DAPL, at least at the initial stage. The people who don't like what we do here are getting more sophisticated, and they're getting better at it, and we better recognize it, because if we can't, and anybody who cares about moving product out of North Dakota to the consumers, whether they be in Texas, Seattle, China, Asia, anywhere, should care about these decisions, because they are trying to shut down our way of life.
Shifting now to police reform. So after the horrific death of George Floyd, there have been continuous conversations both at the statewide and at the national level regarding police reform. Following President Trump's executive order about a month and a half ago, which you were at the White House for, and after the House passed, nearly on political lines, a bill that you voted against, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act of 2020, and the Senate failing to move forward Senator Scott's bill. What do you foresee as the future for police reform, and do you think anything will be accomplished before the November election?
I actually said this on the floor of the House when I said this. I said, you all can criticize President Trump all day long, but in 6 weeks, his executive order is going to be the only meaningful reform that has happened. We'll start on the partisan side of it, and then I'll get into the policy, because this is something I've cared about a lot. I was a criminal defense attorney for 10 years. I chaired our Justice Reinvestment Committee. Criminal justice reform is something I'm absolutely passionate about. But when the Democratic majority in the U.S. House won't accept a single amendment, a Republican amendment, and the Democratic minority in the Senate won't accept a single Republican amendment, I think it becomes abundantly clear this was never about reform, and it was about winning elections, and it was about messaging, which is really unfortunate, because you have to, when you start with police reform, you have to recognize this fact. 2 million out of the 2.3 million people incarcerated in this country are incarcerated in state and local jails and prisons. So when the federal government decides to weigh in on this and they want to change something in downtown Minneapolis, they have to understand that how that affects Grafton's police department, Regent's police department, Fargo's police department. I mean, Fargo's a big community, but I mean, and I have never, in my experience with the federal government, both before I got there and now, have never seen, in our zest to change something in larger communities, I've never seen how it didn't negatively affect smaller communities. So this is a really tough issue to deal with, and it should be. It's hard, and I think there will be a path forward. I unfortunately don't think it'll happen until after the election, but there is hope, and the hope is, and I've told business leaders, and you guys are business community leaders, the place this works well, state legislatures. We've done it in North Dakota. They've done it in New Jersey. They've done it in Texas. Conservative states, liberal states have all done this, but that's where you can really effectuate change. And so Congress's inability to act on things is not a death knell to this particular issue. And listen, there are places where we need to do better. There are racial disparities. Institutional racism is a really interesting term, because institutions can't be racist, but there are institutional racial disparities that exist, and we should recognize those, and we should acknowledge those. And by the way, most of them, or at least a lot of them, aren't designed that way. They're what we call facially neutral, that have a negative disparate impact. And so there are areas where we can work on that. And we've done some really good things in North Dakota on those things, just because it was the right policy, not because it was, I mean, we're not a very diverse state. I mean, we're getting more diverse, which is great, but at the end of the day, we're still 89% white in North Dakota. And so, but we've done a lot of those reforms simply because we've realized being smart on crime is not the same thing as being soft on crime. But if the federal government is going to mandate things to local jurisdictions, then they better figure out a way to pay for it, because otherwise what you will see is small jurisdictions cease to exist. Small community departments will turn it over to the county, because they won't be able to pay the insurance and they won't be able to pay for the equipment. So this is a very tough and nuanced conversation, but I will say this, there are a lot of smart people on both sides of the aisle that are still talking about this after the lights went out.
So recent events have consumed the news cycle as of late, obviously. So what are some things that you're working on that maybe have not received as much attention lately? Police reform, and that has received a lot of attention. The only reason I bring it up is because I've been working on it before.
So it's kind of interesting, because I've been working on this infrastructure and how we I mean, interstate commerce, if you all remember, the state of Washington tried to ban oil trains from coming into it, North Dakota oil trains. So we worked with the state of Washington, or not so much the state of Washington, but the Department of Transportation and state officials here to get what's called preemption, which means instead of us sue to overturn their law, Washington has to sue the federal government to enforce it, because we've recognized these issues are going on at the same time. At the same time, we have the National Defense Authorization Act, which is coming through right now. one of the Democratic members of the committee put an expansion of what's called the Jones Act into the bill. And the Jones Act deals with U.S. ships. And essentially what it does is takes away a waiver for heavy machinery ships to do work on offshore oil rigs. And we don't have any of those ships in the United States, not one. They're foreign-owned ships, so they have a statutory waiver from the Jones Act. Well, this isn't being put in for national security. This is being in to curtail energy production in the Gulf. At the same time, they're curtailing energy production in North Dakota because of pipelines. So there is a constant effort going on to change how we live and work in North Dakota, and that is constantly what I am fighting on a daily basis. And then other issues that you can work on from my committees in the minority are facial recognition, privacy issues, things that I've always cared about that are always, they're actually in the news a little bit because technology is such a big issue. And then the one issue that I've been working on since I got to Congress that has been a lonely place and is getting less lonely is how the disparity in box beef price from what our cattle producers are getting, and how we have a significant bottleneck because 4 companies own all the processing plants in the entire country. And I will tell you, it was a lonely place to be. It's getting less lonely because maybe one of the positive things about COVID is we have recognized that we have vulnerabilities to the supply chain across all industries, but I don't know if any of them have been exposed as much as for our cattle and pork and producers, which is really important. So that's an issue that is really tough. Absolutely. It's really important in North Dakota, and we've been working on it with, unfortunately, not as much success as I would like, but that doesn't mean we're not going to keep pushing forward and trying to solve those problems.
One more question here before we wrap up. The president the other day, just a couple of days ago in the Rose Garden, I believe, talked about DACA and DACA recipients and saying that either had an executive order coming or a piece of legislation that would be moving through Congress. Is there any update, and will we see some sort of immigration reform either from his office or from...
You won't see it from Congress. You just won't. And I will tell you, by the way, this is an issue that I care deeply about. My wife is an immigrant. 10 of my first 15 public defense cases were illegal reentry cases when I was in Grand Forks. Obviously, H-2A visas, H-1B visas. Farm labor is a huge issue. I mean, you combine that with the $600 unemployment and the difficulty in the egg market right now. These are huge issues. I don't know any update on that. The one I do know is about rescinding the order about foreign students, which I think is fantastic. The problem with immigration is always going to be you can't have reform without amnesty reform. Whether it's a border wall, whether it's all of those different issues, which I support, but we've been through this road before. We want to listen. You have a third-year med student going to school that all of a sudden, who her 3 younger brothers are all U.S. citizens, and they're going to deport her back to Brazil, and she doesn't speak Portuguese because she's been here since she was 6 months old. That's not good policy. It's not very Christian. And more importantly, we're not going to do it. So we should solve this, but we should solve it in a way where it doesn't happen again either. And that's where the fight comes. So if there is going to be any DACA reform, it will come from the White House because it is very difficult to get Congress to act on this. But again, like my friend Jimmy Panetta, I don't think anybody would accuse Jimmy Panetta of being a moderate Democrat. I don't think there are a whole lot of people accusing me of being a moderate Republican. But we have to figure out how to solve some of these problems in the short term. And then long term, we have to continue to push, which is what I appreciate about President Trump, Governor Burgum, STEM education. And we have to start growing these people at home. We have the jobs. We have to convert, we have to start doing a better job of preparing our high school kids and our college kids for a 21st century workforce. Because whether it's Microsoft, whether it's the Egg Research Center in Langdon, I fully appreciate all of the people from all over the world who are working in those jobs. But I would prefer that we were filling those jobs with North Dakota kids.
Absolutely. Well, Congressman Armstrong, that's all the time that we have for today. Thank you so much on behalf of Katie, the Chamber, and all of our members for joining us this morning and answering some of our questions. We really appreciate it, and all of the work that you do for the state of North Dakota and the country as a whole.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman.